Our parents give us love, affection, and projection, the vision of who we're destined to be, free. The price we pay is the pain we endure, never in vain though, for our passion is our fuel, school of hard knocks, distance learning our pension, earning every shift, our gifts make room for us by us, playing our position, keeping the dream in motion. Promotion comes from he who stands in the gap, real rap. Everything we envision needs provision and protection. This is for the resurrection of a people till we equal. Correction, we're already beyond it. Obstacles unimaginable, look how we responded. Potential unfathomable, yet we find ignorance appealing. Ceiling, self-imposed. Till we stop feeling and acting worthless on the mother shows, truth be told is about purpose. This is how the story goes. This is another episode of Truth Be Told. I'm the host, Thomas Calhoun, and I'm so proud to be here. An honor to interview Mr. Jonathan Mariner. Thank you for having me.
Great to be here. Thanks for coming down.
So I have a few warm-up questions, and then we're going to get into a little bit about your background and your story. So the first thing I want to say is Lake Taylor. Tell me a little bit about that.
About Lake Taylor. Well,
Yeah.
I went to Lake Taylor High School. It's kind of an interesting experience. When I was there, the first year I was there, the student body was probably 85-90% white.
Mm-hmm.
The very next year, Norfolk went through massive busing, and so so my 10th grade year was 85% white. The next year was probably maybe 50-50, 60-40 black.
Wow.
They basically took all the kids from downtown Norfolk, which was technically closer to Lake Taylor, and brought them in. These were kids who were going to Booker T, and a lot of the kids that were going to a lot of the white suburbs, Hillside in particular, Poplar Halls, all ended up going to Booker T, or at least they were supposed to.
Right.
Norfolk Academy grew out of that experience, in fact.
Oh, wow. That's a really good conversation.
Norfolk Academy was where all the white kids went who didn't want to go to Lake Taylor, or
Anymore.
didn't want to go to Booker T.
You didn't want to go to Booker T or Lake Taylor.
Interesting schools. Interesting, one-year switch in terms of the student
demographics.
body. Yep.
Wahoo wah.
UVA. A lot of people don't know this, but I transferred to UVA from the Naval Academy. I went to the Naval Academy my first 2 years. Went partly because it was free. When I got in, everyone was all excited about me going. Obviously, it's a really big deal to get an appointment to go there. My parents worked for the Navy. My sister was going to Hampton the year before, a private school. My parents couldn't afford to put us both through school, and so I thought I would do the honorable thing and take the full scholarship to Navy.
Right.
Got there, realized I didn't really. I realized I wanted to be a CPA, and I'd always known that going in there, and looked at the curriculum and thought, if I give Navy 4 years, give the Academy 4 years, then the U.S. Navy another 5-year commitment that was required if you stayed the whole time. It'd be 9 years before I got a chance to do what I wanted to do, and so I transferred to UVA.
You transferred to UVA.
It's in-state. I could afford to pay my way. I had a job while I was there, so my parents didn't have to pay for me.
So I too went to UVA for graduate school.
Okay.
And that's why I found that out. I found that pretty curious that we're both from the same area and went to the same school. So that's pretty cool. The last warm-up is 1954. Did anything significant happen in that year?
Brown v. Board of Education.
Yes.
Interesting you to be born.
Yes.
I'd share two other thoughts about that. I was just part of an email exchange with a group of black professionals. Most of these guys go back and forth to talk about golf, but there was an article that one of the guys circulated from Richmond. In fact, he's in New York now, and we talked about Virginia during that time. The issue of massive resistance that came out of Brown v. Board of Education. The two observations that I would make about just my own vintage, growing up in that time, was that when I got to UVA, going back to that for a minute, one of my fraternity brothers, I pledged Kappa when I was there. My fraternity brothers was a year behind me in school, but he was like 2 years older than I was. And we'd always tease him, because at that point, even a year's difference makes you look older. But we were, but he was in, and I can't think of the county now, Virginia, that basically they shut down the school system right after
Wow.
Brown v. Board of Education passed, and schools were forced to integrate. They shut down the school system for 4 years, and this was one of the poor black counties in Virginia. They called it massive resistance. That was the name, the term, back during that time to resist this Supreme Court movement. And a lot of kids, and this Robert was his name, we called him Rip, but he basically didn't go to school for 3 or 4 years, because in these poor communities they couldn't afford to go to the private schools that the white kids, had a chance to go to, and so he literally missed 3 grades. Virginia has this glorious history, having been, the home of Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry and 8 other presidents, but it also has a dark past when it comes to the country does, but Virginia has a big part of that.
You were literally born into this shift, and when I think about all you've accomplished, it seems as if you were born to do it. Right, in a way, right?
One other observation I would mention, I remember in 1964, I was 10 years old, and I remember, and back then, the evening news was a really big deal. There was no other way to get news other than through Walter Cronkite, primarily on CBS. And I remember sitting there when he announced that the President Johnson had signed the Civil Rights Act. And I remember my mother, very clearly, my mother saying to me, now we can go to, some of the movie theaters downtown. Because the only movie theater you can go to at that point in Norfolk was the South Drive-In. You couldn't go to a lot of the places downtown.
How did that propel you forward?
What's interesting is that we talked about Lake Taylor. Well, actually, before I got to Lake Taylor Senior, I went to Lake Taylor Junior High. And there were only, out of, I think, 1,500 students in the school, and it was probably at that point, one of these suburban new schools that had been built in the growing suburbs of Norfolk at the time. There were, of the 1,500 students, there were maybe less than probably 25 black students in the class.
Wow.
And so, I got exposed to this, quote, integrated life very early on.
Yeah.
And it was, I've over the years, I've relayed to some people some of the things that happened. Today, everyone is, politically correct and woke, et cetera. Back then, it was far from it. This was, as we said before, on the fringe of integration, and a lot of old habits and a lot of things people would say, you wouldn't tolerate today. But I remember sitting in a class and having a professor say something, a teacher say something, quite racist, and you're sitting there as a, 13, 14-year-old, and the idea of challenging your teacher, you just,
At that time.
Yeah, you didn't do it. And so I've said to people, my whole approach in terms of how I dealt with that was I called it my Mr. Magoo approach to life. If you remember the old Mr. Magoo cartoon, he would just be driving along and stuff happened around him, and he was just focused on what he needed to get done and ignored all the crashes and things that would happen around him just to stay focused, and that was always my approach. And having said that, I've always admired, there are others, in fact, one of my good friends who passed away, some time ago, but he was also at Lake Taylor Junior High at the time, Leroy Hassell. Leroy ended up, he and I ended up at UVA. He was a year behind me, but we ended up at UVA together. I was at Harvard Business School, he was at Harvard Law School, and he ended up ultimately coming back to Richmond, made partner at the big law firm, McGuire Woods, the youngest to make partner at that time. Ended up chairing the Richmond City School Board, but most importantly, Governor Ballow's at the time appointed him to the Virginia State Supreme Court, and he also became Chief Justice.
Wow.
And Leroy was a type who, was absolutely the fire breather. We're going to fix stuff. I mean, being a lawyer, being an advocate, that was part of his DNA. And we had very different paths to the top. And so so my approach was stay focused on what you want to get done. And Leroy, I give him a lot of credit. People like that was like, if I have to tear this place down and get there, I'm going to do it.
Right.
It takes both.
It takes both. Right. It does take both. It's hard to sometimes for both parties to see eye to eye on how things get done, but I do think at the end it takes both.
And in my view was, in my world, if I tried to basically rattle every cage, there was every opportunity to stifle where I could go. And I thought, I'm going to stay focused, and especially on the financial side. It was a pretty objective way to kind of get ahead. And I thought I'll be hopefully a inspirational model or for people. I'll kind of pave the way, so to speak.
And you talk about that ability to focus. Like, what was it? Something that you learned from your parents? Was it something, were you raised in that way? Like, how did you? Because that's a skill. That's
Sure.
a very to sit there in that class.
Yeah.
A lot of kids today wouldn't be able to do that.
Well,
I wouldn't have been able to do that.
Yeah, a big part of it was simply, and I've heard other people say this too. We grew up in a neighborhood that early on that wasn't, it wasn't a bad neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
It was simply a neighborhood of a lot of working folks.
Mm-hmm.
Places it's since been torn down. In fact, I was in Norfolk I think last year, and I tried to drive by that area, and it's totally different now. But Norfolk, but it's called Chesapeake Manor. And it was basically a bunch
in Norview area?
In the Norview area,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's gone?
It's gone. They've totally knocked it down.
Wow.
And they probably should have. It was literally cinder block houses. It was painted cinder block. There was no drywall. It was, just painted cinder block and
Wow.
and linoleum floors and pretty basic. I remember at the time they had a big sign out front, and the rent started at $52 a month.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty, entry-level housing. My parents didn't, and this is to answer your question, had not gone to college. They met at church, got married at 19, had my sister the next year and me the year after that, and they just, just working to kind of, keep bread on the table and to take care of the family. And my whole focus, their focus for us was, you got to get an education, and so for me,
that was like the focus at that time, right?
And my whole approach was, I want to do better. We would be driving past on the way to church. You drive through these neighborhoods, you see all these nice homes. Like, one day I want to have that, but to get there, you got to work hard. My father always worked 2 and 3 jobs, and I remember a couple times, one job he had in particular, he was adding a room to a woman's house because he was a jack of all trades, could do anything.
Mm-hmm.
He grew up that way. His father passed away when he was about 12 years old, and he just took on all kinds of odd jobs and just used that skill to basically to make some money. And I remember, we started off, building, doing the foundation to the house. We, framing it, drywall, roofing it, et cetera. I remember one day, I'd go after school with him to work on this thing. He'd do this after work. Mm-hmm. And we were, on the, either whether it was mixing concrete or being on the roof, on a hot sun, driving nails, he'd say, you got to stay in school so you don't have to do this all the time.
Yeah.
And
wow.
So you think, and I remember once he got a job, so they opened up a small little insurance office right next to our house once we moved out of the Chesapeake Manor projects, and he knocked on the door and got a job, cleaning the office at night, emptying ashtrays, cleaning the bathroom, and I'd have to go over with him to clean it up. And you do enough of that work, he says, you know what, there's got to be a better way.
Yeah.
And he'd say,
for sure, stay in school.
Work hard. You don't have to do this for the rest of your life.
That's it, right?
Yeah.
So moving forward a little bit, you eventually do work hard, of course. Mm-hmm. You get into the Naval Academy, you transfer, go to UVA, go to Harvard, right? Was Ivy League always in your sights, or was it just?
Not directly. In fact, when I was applying to college from high school, I applied to UVA. Well, first of all, since my parents didn't go to college, unlike today where kids, take these college trips, et cetera, I didn't know anything about college. My parents didn't. Mm-hmm. All we knew was that we're going to go to college and let's try and get into one, and one that we can afford. That was kind of the only focus at the time. And I remember I applied to UVA because all my other classmates were applying to UVA. The Naval Academy recruiter came to the high school, and so that kind of got in the pipeline. It wasn't something I was passionate about, but I followed the trail there. And one of my mom's coworkers, somehow or another, I'm not sure exactly now what the connection was, but she knew someone who was recruited for Dartmouth. And they said, gee, given how good a student he is, he ought to apply to Dartmouth. And I did. And I got in. And so I got into an Ivy League school, but at the, my whole focus at the time was That's first of all, it's a long ways away. It's cold up there, and the most important thing was when I got the financial aid package, it was going to cost, my parents a ton of money. They have this hypothetical, theoretical parental contribution. Well, I knew it wasn't going. They knew it wasn't going to happen. They couldn't write a check, to pay for that. Plus, I was going to have to do work study, and take loans. Versus Navy was free, and so I had a chance to go to an Ivy League school, but I just couldn't afford to do it. In the case of Harvard, it had as much to do with the academic program, the curriculum, the pedagogy. Harvard Business School, has a case method of study.
Yeah.
And when I was at UVA for both my junior and senior year, recruiters came to UVA recruiting for the business school. Mm-hmm. And I, sat in on the session and I was intrigued by the teaching method as much as anything else.
UVA has a case method that
they do
use now.
Yeah, they do. The Darden School.
I believe that a Harvard person started.
Exactly. It was founded by a couple Harvard professors.
Yeah.
And a little known fact, the original Monroe Hall, where the Darden School started, on the main grounds, is almost architecturally similar to the Harvard Business School. They copied the architecture as well as the curriculum. And the Monroe Hill dorms at UVA are a carbon copy of what was the original B School dorms at Harvard. And so, but again, it was obviously the appeal of going to Harvard was there. I didn't know if I'd get in or not. I thought I might have a chance to get a deferred admissions. Back then, they would admit you and you can come in 2 years. And I felt pretty confident that I had a shot, but ended up getting in directly from UVA, which back then wasn't as rare as it is today. Today, they take very few, of almost no students directly from college.
Right.
But I tell people one of the happiest, the 3 happiest days of my life were, the day my oldest son was born, winning a World Series ring, and getting the phone call, because the recruiter called me, that I got into Harvard. I mean, I remember I was in the kitchen, and I actually shouted and jumped up and down. So it was a big deal for me.
Yeah, for sure. That's a major accomplishment, particularly right out of undergrad. Yeah. It's hard to get in, even if you haven't had a gap. Right.
True.
So they're competitive. The way you find opportunities, I hope if people don't get anything else out of this, the way it defies. Like when people now go to look for a job, it's Indeed. I shouldn't be shouting that out, but it's online recruiting platforms, right? Resume farms, if you will. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's Friends, LinkedIn. The way you look for jobs is completely different. And can you just talk briefly about what that's like? What's that process like? Because
I wish I could say it was totally scripted. It's been somewhat, circumstantial, somewhat fortuitous. The one thing I would say is that I've always, throughout my career, thought about my path. Where do you want to get to, and how can you get there? I remember when I was at MCI, I was a senior manager. I started as a manager, got promoted to senior manager. The next position was director. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to be a director because the benefits and the title, all of that was something I really wanted. And, my boss was a director, and so I really didn't have a lot of space to go. And one day I remember he mentioned there's a director's position that oversees credit and collections, in the operational part of the business. So he's a good friend. He was being very helpful to me career-wise. And I remember thinking, I know you want the title, but that's not the path that's going to get you to where you want to go. So if you end up running...
How did you know that wasn't the path?
Because just understanding, how organizations work, where people reported up to. This reported up to the controller versus reporting to the CFO. My boss reported to the CFO, who at the time was Bill Conway, who left and went on to start the Carlyle Group.
These are some major people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but my sense was I'll be managing, probably 100 people, in the credit collections department. These are people that, badge you to pay your long distance bill, et cetera. Mm-hmm. A lot of hourly workers, and my sense was a lot of it would just be making sure that Bob or Betty showed up. They needed a babysitter. You got to have someone to fill in it. It was just it didn't require a lot of strategic thinking. It was more operationally oriented. And I also thought that if that's on my resume and my next job is to do something that's more strategic, that's not the job path that'll get me there. And so I turned it down. My point being, I've always, and I've said this to people I've spoken to, including my own sons, whenever I think about a job, and the same was true when I was looking to leave Ryder, I don't think about that job. I think about what will that lead to? What path will that put me on? And is it the same path that I'm trying to get to? And so, some people
have real long-term vision.
Yeah, that's just been the way I've approached things. Some people approach, jobs based on what does it pay. They may want a title, but I've always thought, well, I want to think much further than that. How will this look to the employer after this one?
Gotcha.
And so that's
chestnut checkers, huh?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate.
But still, the execution of let me call a friend.
Yeah.
Let me call somebody in the space, or
I'm a big believer in networking, and as I've told my career story to people, I always underscore the fact that it is really important to have a network, and one that you can really not lean on, but one that's reliable. Just collecting a business card isn't as important as creating real relationships with people.
Once you get out of Harvard, what's your first job? Like, what's the first thing you decide to do?
My intention is I had taken a job from coming out of UVA to work for one of the big accounting firms, KPMG. They were called Pete Marwick back then. And I had accepted a job initially out of Harvard to go back with that firm in D.C. to work in the tax department.
Okay.
But I ended up, at the time I was dating someone, we ultimately ended up getting married, but I wanted to stay in Boston, and that actually found, just through a series of circumstances trying to find something to do just for the summer, I ended up getting offered to stay at Harvard on the admissions board as assistant director of admissions. And so I did that for almost 2 years. My future wife ended up getting a job in D.C., and that led me to go to D.C.
Okay, so that's how you got to D.C.
Exactly.
And then walk us through how you get from D.C. to Florida, which is important.
So my first job in D.C. was with a small boutique consulting firm. There were two African-American men who were partners at two of the biggest consulting firms at the time, McKinsey and Booz Allen. They started this company called Ferguson Bryan. Jim Ferguson and Al Bryan were the two founders. It was really a premier firm. They had probably 40, 50, we may have been as many as 80 or 90 professionals on the consulting staff, competing head-to-head with the big consulting firms, doing a lot of government consulting in particular. And it was just a great time. I mentioned it because I remember thinking, working for a black-owned company felt so special. It was like all of the issues you think about, in working for a large organization where you happen to be a minority, they just kind of go away.
Yeah,
It was kind of but the two partners ended up splitting up, which happens, and I got a job at MCI back in its early days.
Maybe that's why it was called the MCI Center.
Yep.
I didn't even think about that.
Yep, that was back in there. They were kind of like the disruptors. They went after AT&T, which was a monopoly at the time.
There was a big long distance. I remember
long
there was a
distance.
long distance.
They were
battle.
exactly. They started. AT&T provided both local service through the Bell system. They owned all the Bell local companies as well as AT&T was actually the long distance company. The Bell system, Bell South, Bell Atlantic, all of those companies were basically part of the AT&T system, providing local service. Bill McGowan started MCI to compete in the long distance side of the business, and he sued AT&T. The government basically went after him for antitrust purposes, and AT&T broke up because of that operation.
Wow!
And it was kind of exciting being with one of the first disruptors in the space.
It's interesting. I feel like I remember there was in a commercial there was a phone with a pin drop or something like that, because back then the the issue with long distance was it wasn't clear.
Yeah, the quality.
The
exactly.
quality.
Yep.
I think
And
that
so,
was the original MCI commercial.
So, but that was, and I told people, those of us who were with MCI back, during that time, that the digital revolution today, in our minds, was started by Bill McGowan. By forcing the breakup of AT&T, you basically gave other competitors access to the home. The last mile, it's called in the business. Now everyone's fighting to get into the home, be it the cable companies, with internet service, et cetera. But AT&T at the time had a monopoly. They had the last mile to every home in the country. For the most part, they probably controlled 95% of the market. There were a couple of smaller carriers, GTE and a few others, but for the most part, AT&T controlled everything. But once they broke up, all of those, baby bells as they were called, they all ended up, merging and splitting up and being acquired. But a lot of the, the companies today that are in the digital media, internet space were all basically, if you trace them back, they have some lineage back to the AT&T. They're competing today, but back then there was no competition, and so Bill McGowan, we say, really kind of pushed the digital revolution in a way that wasn't intended, but it led to what we see today.
That's interesting. Snapchat, thinking about communication, right? So Snapchat today, I saw on CNBC this morning, they're trying to sue Facebook in a similar fashion, right?
Yep.
And I didn't consider that juxtaposition, but it is it's the same thing, happening.
It's everyone's fighting to get into the home in some way.
Or get your attention,
Get your attention, exactly.
And the home now is your phone, right?
Yep, exactly.
Right.
So
yeah.
But that was my MCI experience. It was had a wonderful experience, and about the same time that AT&T was finally being broken up, MCI was reorganizing. I ended up getting offers to MCI ended up going to a regional format to kind of mirror the AT&T system. They broke up into 7 regional companies at the time. Pacific Bell, NYNEX was one of the companies, Bell South, Bell Atlantic, Southwest Bell. They all broke up into separate companies, and MCI formed regions to mirror that competitively. And I had an offer to go to San Francisco to work for MCI or to go to Atlanta. In retrospect, I probably should have gone to San Francisco because that was 1985.
The venture capital world was just opening up.
Barely. But I couldn't afford it, housing wise. Even then? Oh my gosh, it's always been expensive. And I was about to accept an offer to take a director of finance position in Atlanta. But a headhunter at the same time had been pushing me to look at this job opportunity in Miami. And when I finally made the decision that I'm going to actually leave DC, because I love being in DC, my family was there, et cetera, I thought, okay, I'll take a look. I'd never been to Florida before. At all. So it wasn't even the weather that attracted me, although a day like today makes you think it is. But I came down and, long story short, I ended up getting an offer to work at Ryder.
Wow.
And decided to relocate to come down here.
What was the catch? You've never been to Florida.
The catch.
What was the thing that
the biggest catch was twofold on both ends. On the one hand, it was clear that MCI was going to become more of an engineering focus because they had to build out their network, and the finance role, while important, wasn't going to be the primary driver of the business. On the flip side, Ryder was primarily a finance company. I mean, truck leasing was their business. It's just one big leasing operation, and specifically, I ended up being hired to work in a financial planning and strategy group, and my role initially was doing acquisitions. And so I was going into a heavy finance area. So for me, career-wise, I thought this is a way to really hone my financial skills, and I ended up running one of the financial units, one of the acquisition units, doing mergers and acquisitions for Ryder.
That is amazing, because that would end up being the thing that set you apart when looking for the next major opportunity, right? Getting that experience and that exposure from a position perspective. So now it's important that where you are, you're already in Florida, in Miami for that matter, doing merger and acquisition, and then you get another call, Right, another opportunity. And what's that?
Well, I'm not sure if you're alluding to the sports job. I had a job before that.
Oh, okay.
So I'm at Wright. I've been there for about 4 years. Had moved from the financial planning role to more of a controllership role with one of their operating units. It was the insurance operation. And really, wanted a bigger challenge. And one of my former Wright colleagues had left about a year before to be CFO at the Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau.
Right.
Which is a kind of quasi-public, public-private entity in Miami-Dade County. She was leaving to follow her former boss someplace, and called me up and asked if I'd be interested, because her, leaving after only a year, she had the pressure of her boss, the guy who ran it, saying, find your replacement. So she called me up, and I interviewed with the head of the organization, and we met over drinks, and he made me an offer pretty much on the spot.
Wow.
And I, as I've told this story many times, I took the job for 3 reasons. Number one, it was going to be a chance to be a CFO, which is kind of the next step for me. I've been in basically a support role, financial services, corporate role for some time, but this was going to be a chance to be a CFO. The second reason was that the organization was going through a real financial strain. They were cash constrained. The CEO had this huge growth plan for the organization, and I would add, as an aside, his name was George Kirkland. He's passed away now. He had come to Miami from San Francisco, and a couple years later ended up going to L.A. But in all 3 places, running the Convention and Visitors Bureau, he created a vision for elevating those markets. And I will say, and those of us who worked with him, this is back in the late '80s, South Beach is what it is today because of George Kirkland. He was the one because the job of the Bureau was to promote South Florida as a tourism and convention destination. And he had this vision that he worked with hoteliers, with the city fathers to expand the convention center, to add new hotels, and to basically get meeting planners to want to come and vacationers to want to come to South Florida, and created this whole campaign that kind of stylized Miami.
And what year is this?
This was 1989 when I joined. He came in '87. I was there from '89 to '92. But he created the buzz. I remember one of the campaigns was Miami, a city with a rhythm all its own. It was all about trying to set it apart. A number of hoteliers came down from New York, and with the support of the Convention Bureau, they started buying up all these beat up former hotels along Ocean Drive in Miami, and started to slowly convert, working with the Convention Bureau, going on different destination tours to promote Miami and around the world. Really, it really helped make what South Beach is today. But I was there for 3 years. George left to go to L.A., and downtown L.A. now is what it is because, again, of George's vision. But when he left, a gentleman by the name of Merritt Sturheim came to town, and people from South Florida would know that name quite well. He was at one point the county manager for Miami-Dade County, and was part of the county's growth as he was county manager there. And subsequent to that, he ended up being, I think, interim mayor for probably 5 or 6 different cities, plus the school board, following different scandals that Miami seems to have a knack for. But just this really hard-driving, politically savvy, public servant that took over the Bureau, and I worked for him for a couple of years. And by the 3rd year, we had kind of gotten the organization stabilized. I mentioned, 2 of the reasons. The second reason I mentioned going there was because it was in financial straits. The growth vision that George had put a lot of financial strain on the organization. By the time George left, Merritt had a slower approach, a more fiscally conservative approach. We were able to kind of get the organization under control, and I found myself kind of being bored. But the third reason, before I forget, is that I took the job was that the board of directors was the who's who of Miami, Dade County, and I just thought,
that's
given
a good networking opportunity.
Given the challenge ahead of us and the stage on which you're going to perform, boy, if you could, kind of a high wire act, if you can get this done, you could probably get, it'll help your career, and it did
for sure.
because
so one of those people, right? Would be how you got to the Marlins.
No, it just so happens that in the summer of 1991, Major League Baseball was adding 2 teams.
Right.
They ended up giving a franchise to Wayne Heisinger, who at the time was running Blockbuster here in Florida, and they gave a franchise to a guy named Jerry McMorris in Denver, for the Rockies.
Yeah.
And I'm not a baseball fan, but I'm reading the newspaper, the Miami Herald. I remember it was December 1st, 1991. I remember the date so clearly, and they had an article about the front office. Back in June, when they were awarded the franchise, I went to they had the unveiling for the logo, et cetera. I was there, I got a little memorabilia from that, so everyone kind of knew Florida is finally getting a baseball team.
Okay.
After
Which
all
makes
this
sense. I mean,
yeah.
everybody's training down
They
here.
probably,
anyway.
they probably had about 20, at that
Yeah.
time, probably close to 20 plus teams were training down
Yeah.
here in Florida at the time. Maybe more than that. I think there were maybe only 6 or 8 teams in Phoenix at the time, in Arizona. But it was a really big deal. So fast forward from July to now December, they're talking about them building out the front office. There's an article about the front office. It has an organizational chart with photos and names, and they had 2 boxes where it says not yet named. One was VP of Public Affairs, the other was VP of Finance. It just so happens that all the other faces were basically white males. There were a few Hispanics. Cookie Rojas was one of our scouts at the time, and a few others. But there was a lot of criticism in this article about, gee, everyone looks kind of the same.
Mm-hmm.
And
I assume male.
And Carl Barger, who's the president at the time, said, don't worry, we're not done yet. We've got a few more hires to go. And I'm thinking, okay, And so I called a friend of mine who knew the Robbie family, and they were going to be playing at Joe Robbie Stadium. I thought she might know somebody there. I'm just curious, like, what's going on? They got a couple jobs open, and I'm thinking about the finance job. And my bureau job had kind of flattened out to where there's no real challenges left. It was kind of, okay, I can do this in my sleep now. What's next? And so I called this friend of mine, Barbara Gothard, who at the time was doing some PR consulting, but she had been head of public affairs for Burger King before that, and well known around the city. And I said, Barbara, what's going on there? She says, you know what, I know the Marlins folks. I've been talking to them, and they're still looking, and you'd be a great candidate. If you give me your resume, I'm going to see them later this week. I'll give them your resume. And
amazing.
so we had breakfast. I first had to put together a resume because I didn't have one that was updated. She and I met a couple of days later. It was a Thursday. We met for breakfast. I gave her my resume. I get home from work Friday afternoon, Friday evening, and there's a voicemail message on my home phone from the Marlins saying they want to talk to me.
And of course, you get the job.
Got the job.
And it was VP of Finance.
Yep.
And you worked there how long?
I was there for a little under 10 years, 9+ years. Wayne Heisinger owned the team for 7 years. He sold the team to John Henry. John subsequently sold it. John owned the team for about 3+ years. He sold the team and now owns the Red Sox. So I worked for John for 2 years, Wayne for 7+, John for a little over 2 years.
So these positions, I want to focus on them because they're building up to what you're currently doing now. And that's why I'm kind of rapid fire going through them because I think it's really important how you got there. So how do you go from VP of Finance for one team to the CFO for the whole shebang?
A couple of, somewhat fortuitous, if not serendipitous, opportunities kind of led the way for that. The first was in, the Marlins franchise. I joined in early February 1992. We were going to start our first season in April of '93, which we did. By August of '94, baseball had a strike. Now, we all knew leading up to that there was going to be a labor issue. Baseball at that point had always had labor issues. And the league office had decided that they were going to form a task force of 8 CFOs to study the issue of revenue sharing and the salary cap. Those are the 2 big issues that were being negotiated with the players back then. And in putting together this task force, they wanted to put one of the 2 expansion team CFOs on this committee. and they just chose me. Again, they could have picked the other guy, but
Yeah,
they
for
chose
sure.
me. And so I had a chance to work with the league office people and a lot of the outside professionals, working on, this league-wide issue. So that gave me visibility back in New York. Just by coincidence, or what's interesting, is that one of the people that I worked with, this goes back to 93, 94 time frame, was this young lawyer with Morgan Lewis, Rob Manford, who's currently the commissioner today.
Wow.
But and in
Wow.
fact, the current CFO who took my place was an outside consultant to baseball, Bob Starkey, back then as well. So so it gave me exposure to a lot of people who would be key players down the road. So that was kind of part one. Part two is when I made the decision to leave the Marlins, and I'm not sure if depending which version of my bio you look at, the shortened versions, I cut out a lot of the things that are non-sports related. But when Wayne sold the team to John Henry in 1999, in fact, in 98, he was already planning to sell the team. And I thought when John Henry came forward, I didn't know who John was. I had not met him before. He's a finance guy. I thought he'll have his own finance team. I'm going to look for something else to do as we work towards the sale. And so I met a guy who had started a charter school company here in Fort Lauderdale. And through the same connection, Barbara Gothard, once again, she knew John Hage, who founded this company. And we had breakfast, and he was trying to raise money. And I said, look, I like the concept. I like what you're trying to do. This is 1998, really. And so I, was one of his first investors in the company, and was going to come on full time. Then I met John Henry. Spent 5 hours with John. He convinced me to stay with the Marlins, to work for him and to work on, at the time, leading the effort to get a new ballpark built. This is again back in 98, 99 time frame. And so I ended up, putting this charter school opportunity on hold.
Were you going to go work for them?
I was going to work for them, yeah.
Oh,
because
okay.
I'm thinking,
so you're going to invest in
because the team's about to be sold. I don't know the new
Ah.
owner. I'm thinking, okay, he'll bring his own CFO in, so I'm going to
Sure.
look for the next thing to do. But John convinced me to stay. After 2 years, it was kind of a grinding 2 years, working with a lot of politicians and urban planners, working on this ballpark effort. I was still CFO as well, but I just kind of got burned out and thought, you know what, I can't do this anymore. Because John's whispering in my ear, the charter school guy, saying, we just got to, at the time, like a
But you still invested in that charter
Oh,
school?
yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he tells me that they gotten a significant investment from Michael Milken and his education company. And I thought, wow, this is, and so I basically said, I'm out. I'm going to leave. I'm going to do this startup deal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I saw Bud Selig, just to get back to how I ended up getting to New York. I see Bud Selig at Tony Perez was being inducted to the Hall of Fame in 2000. And I was there. We were all, because Tony worked for us at the Marlins at the time as a special assistant to Dave Dombrowski, the GM. And while I was there, I see Bud Selig, and I say to Bud, just so you know, I'm going to be, when the season's over, I'm going to be leaving the Marlins. He says, look, I want to keep you in the game. Come talk to me. Call me next week. And so this is
the commissioner of baseball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Again, that early exposure, because I would go to owners' meetings with Wayne Heisinger. Mm-hmm. So I got a chance to get more exposure by going to these meetings with Wayne. Mm-hmm. So I called Bud. He says, we want to keep you in the game. Call me. And I ended up flying to New York, meeting with one of his key lieutenants who talked to me then about coming to New York to be CFO. I had 2 kids still in high school here in Florida. I just wasn't ready to make the move. We talked about maybe doing something on a consulting basis, and I just never felt comfortable with what they were laying out, and so I turned it down, and I joined the charter school company as their chief operating officer.
That I did not find.
Yep, as their COO. At the time, they had just acquired another block of schools out of Texas, so we probably had about 20 schools between Florida and Texas. Wow. A lot of challenges, and it was a pure operating role, and so I jumped in to do that. 2 years in, we ended up having a meeting with a guy who had a larger charter school operation in Michigan, and we talked about merging our companies. And I remember it was Super Bowl weekend. We were in Grand Rapids, Michigan, meeting on Monday, with this guy. But we were in Michigan on Super Bowl Sunday. I remember that so clearly. I remember flying back, thinking, okay, if this happens, they've got a young guy who's their COO. I says, you know what, it's probably a good time. It's been 3 years. Let me figure out what I'm going to do next. And so I called someone in baseball, because MLB was at the same time in the headlines, hadn't been that close to him. They were about to acquire the Expos and move them out of Montreal. Mm-hmm. John Henry was selling the Marlins to the Expos owner, Jeff Luria. And so Jeffrey was going to buy the Marlins. John is selling the Marlins to buy the Red Sox. It was kind of a three-way deal. And I thought, well, since baseball is going to own the Expos, they're going to need someone to help them run it. And so I called thinking maybe I'll help them, run the Expos. I'll be CFO, I'll consult, whatever. Mm-hmm. And I called a friend who, said, hey, what's going on in New York? He called Bud, unbeknownst to me. Bud calls me, tells him, have him call me. And so I called Bud, and he says, wow. I'm doing something in New York. I'm reorganizing the office. I got something in mind. You're my first choice for this role. And he wouldn't tell me what it was. He said, call me next week. And so for the next 2 weeks, I'd call him. He says, I'm not there yet, and then one day I'm actually in Texas visiting one of our charter schools. I'm on the road with a weak signal. I get a call from Bob Dupay, who was going to be the new president of the league. And he says, Jonathan, I'm going to be in Florida in a couple of days. Can you meet me to have lunch, and let's finish our conversation from 2 years ago? And so Bob flew in. I met him at the airport. We went to a local place to get lunch, and he offered me the CFO job over lunch. In fact, he said, "Can you start like next week?" I'm like, Bob, no, I'm running a company. I need some time to transition. But that's how I ended up. It was simply a series of connections that just kind of continued from earlier roles I've been in.
I had never heard the term CIO used for Chief Investment Officer.
Yeah.
Right? And so when I read that, I was like, man, he was CFO and CIO? This guy's bad, Right? And so when I dug more into it, I was like, oh, that makes sense. So I said, okay, I want to learn more about, because you had some merger and acquisitions experience all along the way, right? So now you're CIO, or you become CFO and you transition into CIO. Yep. What was that transition like? Explain that.
Well, it was pretty straightforward, and it wasn't something I'd actually planned to do. I'd been CFO for, at one point, 10 plus years. 2012, I've been CFO. At MLB for 10 years in 2012, and Bud Selig announces he's going to be retiring into the 2014 season. And so I knew then, and I was also knew I'd be essentially 60 years old and would have been a CFO in some way for the last 25 plus years. And I thought, you know what, with Bud retiring, a new commissioner is going to come in. We have at the time no idea who it's going to be, whether I'm going to work for them, whether they want me to work for them. And I thought, if you're going to make a career change, this is the time to think about it. And so I started thinking at that point about what I'm going to do next. I, reached out to a lot of different colleagues. One fellow UVA alum was running one of the big headhunting firms, Russell Reynolds at the time. And so I reached out to him, just like, what's out there? I haven't looked for a job in a dozen years. And we talked about a number of different things to do.
So I think it's important there, because when you were in New York, you're not going to fly back and forth from New York. I assume your sons are out of high school or something at this point. So now you set up residence. I guess in New York you get a place, right? You're not going to commute every day from Florida. So because of that, you have a place in New York, and you apparently didn't sell your place here. So talk about dual residency, and we always talk about, so Truth Be Told is a show about purpose, right? And what I like to do is focus on ownership for Black people, because it's super important that even though you have high profile positions that create obviously a lot of revenue for you, and personally, I think it's important though that we have ownership as well in businesses. And you spoke about earlier working for a Black-owned company and how some of those things are just thrown out. So now you are yourself a black-owned company with tax day.
Yeah.
Like, talk about the experience that you had that drove you to that.
Well, when I talk about it, I always use the phrase necessity is the mother of invention.
Absolutely.
And, you know, when I was with my early Marlins days, we had our first road trip to Colorado. And, you know, being based in Florida, we had no state income tax in our payroll system. But our tax people said to me, we've got to withhold 3 duty days of income tax for the entire, you know, traveling party in Colorado while we were playing 3 games there. And I'm like, really? Because most people don't know that. And so I had my exposure to it going back.
You have to pay taxes
in
for
Colorado.
the time.
Exactly. The income you earn
while there
in Colorado as an athlete, it's not just baseball players. Colorado says, in other states as well, you've earned it in my state, you got to pay taxes on it. I tell people it's no different than thinking about it like sales tax. You know, the fact that you don't live in New York, when you go to New York, you got to pay sales tax.
Sure.
And it's the same concept when it comes to earning income in a different jurisdiction. So I had some exposure to it already. I moved to New York. I'm traveling. You know, my youngest son was actually still in high school for the first year that I was in New York, the first 2 years actually. So I was going back and forth. You know, between Florida and New York, and I thought, you know, okay, I can allocate my income between the 2 jurisdictions, and it worked well until I bought a condo in New York in 2005, which, you know, puts you on the radar. You know, New York has even expanded how they can find out where you are and what you're doing, and that, in my case, triggered them coming after me to say, you owe us New York taxes because we think you're a full-time resident, not a part-time resident. And so that led to 2 different audits. Fast forward, as I'm leaving MLB, I'm looking to come back to Florida. You know, in the midst of the audits, I decided to go ahead and not fight it anymore, establish residency going forward in New York until now I'm leaving New York to come back to Florida. And I wanted to make sure I didn't have any issues like having accurate records and backup receipts to prove that I was not in New York. And that was a problem I had when I was being audited before. And so I, you know, decided I'm going to build an app.
Wow.
You know, I'm leaving baseball. It'd be kind of something, you know, and like most entrepreneurs, you always underestimate what it really takes to build a business.
For sure. Sure.
But I had, you know, a combination of the idea. You know, I had, you know, the capital to do it. I didn't have to go out and raise money to do it, so I could do it right away. And also, the company that built the app for me, I had worked with them, had actually hired them to do a lot of work for me back in the early days of my career in New York in baseball. And so I reached out. They built some software systems for me, some reporting systems. So I reached out to those guys. They said, we can do that for you. So I had it, you know, I didn't have to search to find someone. I knew I had a company that I knew and trusted. I had you know, the capital to do it. And so
still working for you, yeah.
And so I was able to kind of get it. So that's where tax day, that's where it all started.
Excellent. I think so. Talk a little bit about exactly what tax day does.
It's a relatively simple concept. Most states have a threshold over which you become statutorily, whether you think you are or not, a full-time resident. And in case of New York, it's 183 days. 22 states have the similar threshold. Some states have a 6-month threshold. Some have 9 months. But in the case of New York, if you maintain, they call it a permanent place of abode. They don't say if you own a home. If you have a place that you have a key to the lock and it has a toilet and a refrigerator and a stove, essentially, it's that, you know, that you have access to, whether your kids own it, whomever, you're deemed to have a permanent place of abode. And if you spend more than 183 days in New York through business trips, whatever, they will deem you to be statutorily a full-time resident. What that means is all of your income gets taxed in New York. All of it. If you can sell your house in California, New York will tax the profits. California may too, but that's the impact of it all. And that's why it's so critical to a lot of people. And so the app is designed to automatically keep track of where you are. We did several things. You know, every person has a phone. Every phone has GPS tracking in it, location tracking. So you simply read that data off your phone. We added the residency rules of all 50 states into the app because different states have different rules about what's considered to be a day. and what the threshold is. And so the app is designed to automatically tell you when you're approaching a threshold.
In one of these states.
In any particular state.
Yeah.
And if you, while you're traveling, and it was useful for me, when I use a digital boarding pass, I'll take a screenshot of my boarding pass. And so when the app says you're now in New York, I can go in, put the reason for the trip, and I can attach a copy of the boarding pass. Or better yet, when I fly home to Florida and I pick up my car in the garage, they'll send me a digital receipt of me landing in Florida, and I'll attach that, because the key is you have to prove that you're not in New York.
Yeah.
They'll always assume you're in New York unless you can prove you're not in New York. And so the app provides a consistent record of a way to consistently record where you are, so that if you're audited, you have third-party documentation, something I didn't have to do my audit. That makes a real difference.
So you knew what the problem space was.
Yes.
It's very difficult to keep track of all that stuff. So then, but what I think is also really cool is, like, from a customer segment perspective, you had access to all these high net worth individuals who might have this problem. Because for the average person, you probably wouldn't.
I knew where to find them.
Yeah. Right. So I think that's really, really cool as well. With regard to, like, so what do you think, like, the value proposition is? I think you charge like a subscription or something.
Yeah, we charge a $10 a month subscription.
It's very cheap.
Very cheap
for somebody who has the kind of money to be in that scenario.
Yep. And we went back and forth on the pricing. At one point, we thought, should we just make it free and just kind of get it into as many hands as possible? We decided against that for two reasons. Number one, people will value things that they pay for.
For sure.
And number two, for the apps out there like a Facebook that want to simply build, followers, the monetization model is usually built around advertising. And we didn't want to do that. We thought that this is a personal, sensitive issue. I personally hate ads on any software devices. And I thought, I want to have a nice, clean experience. And so we decided to go with a modest subscription model that I thought, if I can just get to a certain number of monthly subscribers, it's a nice revenue stream. And I've in the several interviews I've done early on, people would say, so what's your goal? And I says, this is not intended to be the next Facebook or the next, the next Uber. I said, my goal is, number one, to make enough money to pay for the development costs, and number two, to make enough money to get back what I had to give to New York State.
Oh, you end up having to pay?
I had to write a check.
Because you didn't have.
I had to settle it. We ended up having, but to settle, unless you got them dead to rights, you got to kind of buy your way out of it, and they know that. Yeah. And I thought, if I can get enough money to get back my settlement, then I'm ahead of the game.
You're not going to IPO or anything.
No. I don't. This is an application that, in some respects, is targeting the 1%ers.
For sure. That's why I was wondering: are there enough people in your target market, your total
I thought market? if I don't need 1 million subscribers. If I got 10,000 subscribers at $10 a month,
that's a decent.
It'll cover my beer tab.
Like, from a provision perspective, like typically for-profit companies, right? You get share, stock options and things. How does that work compensation-wise when you're at a? I assume MLB is a nonprofit at one point before you switched it.
Yeah, there's no stock in MLB.
Right. So then, what does that compensation structure look like for an executive in that?
It is strictly salary and bonus.
Really?
You just get a lot of cash.
Wow. Well, that's good. So the challenge question I'll have to be the last question is along the lines of something that's been in the news lately, and I think you have expertise in it. You'll understand anyway. So I don't know if you've heard about WeWork.
Yes.
And their IPO issues and then I want to juxtapose it because of your background and just because of the conversation, the platform we're building. We're in a scenario where less than 1% of any company is going to be venture backed. Right? Roughly 1%. We'll call it for easy math. A little less than 1% of that 1% is going to be a black company that gets venture capital, right? So when I looked and I read the Business Insider breakdown of how all the things that were going on in this, I was like, I don't think I would have been able to get away with this for this long and raise that much money, right?
Yeah.
Right? And so from you as having been an investor, having been involved in merger acquisition, I'm sure you understand the process through and through. Like, talk to me about how important it is for black companies to be able to find black investors, right? And black people who are affluent to be black, become investors in black companies, and just that whole landscape, the venture capital landscape, from your perspective.
Look, I won't claim to be an expert in this space. From my observations, I would say that investors tend to lock into at least two things. Number one is the entrepreneur, the person itself. A lot of the big deals that have been funded, whether they make money or not, have usually come from a network of people that simply believed in them, the entrepreneur himself.
Sure.
But the second is to actually have a concept that, in the case of a WeWork or Facebook, that's scalable at some level. And you've got to have a story behind it. And clearly, if you could find black investors to back you, that would be ideal. But I would say, there's a much bigger funnel of white investors out there. Hopefully the idea doesn't only appeal to black investors.
For sure.
So
then the question would be it's really difficult. Black men and women are having a hard time even raising in that space. So how do you navigate?
It has as much with the network as it does the idea itself. In fact, a good friend of mine does an annual golf, more social than competitive outing every year up at Boca Raton. John Utendahl is his name. And the last 2 years, he added kind of a content element. It's mostly social, but we had kind of a town hall piece, one, after the kind of a midday lunch, town hall, Q&A session with some of the CEOs. The people who attend are probably 3 dozen of the top black executives. Guys like Dick Parson, Robert Smith, Ken Chenault, all attend this kind of an event. But we decided to add to talk about sports. John wanted to add a sports element. And so I've done 2 different panels with this group. And one of the things that I presented to this group is that statistically, in fact, the question I would ask them is, I said, what would you think if I would have told you that you could take 1,500 African American men and every year give them $4 billion? People say that's unheard of. Who could ever do that? The fact of the matter is, if you look at the number of African American professional athletes between basketball, baseball, and football, there are 1,500 African American athletes in those 3 sports. Hockey is a nominal amount. And if you look at how much they make, gross, $4 billion. After tax, it's $2 billion. The proposition that, and everyone in the group says, I can't believe that. We were talking about, to your question about, how do you fund these black interests? I'm saying today, every year, 1,500 African American men get $2 billion a year. Yeah. And the question is, how should that? How do you is that a potential source to your question,
for sure,
entrepreneurs? And I'm encouraged to see people like Stephen Curry and Kobe and KD and others get involved in the venture world. And presumably, when an entrepreneur gets in front of one of them, they don't have the same filtering that they might otherwise get if they sit in front of one of the bigger firms. And so the point is, I think there's a universe out there. The question is, how do you access it?
How do you access it? That's it, man. That's a wrap.